Hi students, this is our BSB 102 online biology class, and today we are continuing the cycle of lectures about evolution. This particular lecture will be about mechanisms of evolution. Before we walk over the particular mechanisms, explaining how exactly evolution proceeds, we need to go over a concept of population. What does it mean, population? When you read literature about uh, evolution, you always find that they talk about populations. Population is defined as a group of individuals belonging to the same species, living in the same area and able to crossbreed. Note the same area. It's important because population always has some concrete borders, geographical borders. It is not just a group of individuals, but organisms, but it is a group of organisms living somewhere, right, in the same area and able to crossbreed. On this picture you see population of seals on Cape of Good Hope, Africa. That's the southernmost point of Africa. Uh, Obviously there are some Antarctic influences there, and the seals love to um, breed there. They like these sandy beaches. Now, to understand why these uh, seals form a population, first question, can sea lions belong to this population? The answer is no, because this population consists of organisms that will not crossbreed with sea lions, right? They're different species. They do not cross-mate. They will not have a healthy, fertile progeny. Uh, then another question: do seals living on Cape Horn, that's the southernmost point of South America, belong to this population? Again, the answer is no, because they're geographically different. They live in a different area, not in the same area. It's another example of a population. Here you see these beautiful sunflowers growing in Ukraine. It's a population, and again, occasionally you see poppies near or actually even between uh, sunflower plants growing in the same area, really close to sunflowers. Do they belong to the same population? No. They are different species, so they cannot be considered part of this population. They can form their own population, but they're not part of the population of sunflowers. And another question, can the sunflowers growing in Kansas belong to this population? Again, no. Too far. Geography is very different. This is, the Kansas sunflowers may be identical, actually, to these sunflowers in their appearance, in their properties, structure, function, but they are far away. They're not in the same area, so they're not the same population. Uh, Now, when we talk about evolution, one of the first questions that arises is what actually evolves? Like, do you evolve? Do I evolve? No. Individuals do not evolve. Evolution does not concern individual organisms. Organisms change, of course, right? They age, they may become sick, and the sickness changes them, but that's not what biological evolution is, right? So evolution does not concern individuals. Individuals do not evolve. See, in this cartoon, it is shown that an ape is evolving into Charles Darwin, but that's of course a joke, right? Darwin did not evolve from or to an ape. It just doesn't happen. What evolves? Populations do. Populations do evolve. And to illustrate this point, look at this picture showing butterflies. You see a population of 6 butterflies, right, in the top row, and it says generation 1. So it's a population caught at a particular and photographed at a particular moment of time. And it is, you see that there are 2 colors of butterflies. Some butterflies have lighter color of their wings, body, and some have darker color. The darker ones are minority. This is nature, this is obvious, this always happens, right? In the previous lecture, we went over the concept of variation, this undefined variation, which is not because of anything that the organisms do, not because they adapt to something, not because they exercise or what, they're just born a little different. This dark butterfly is a butterfly. It has basically the same structure. It has the same lifestyle, habits, etc., place of living, place of breeding, and it can crossbreed with other butterflies in the same population. But it has its slight difference. It's darker because it was just born that way, because we contemporary sophisticated people, we know that it's because of genes, and genes mutate, and mutations bring this diversity into populations. Then what you see also on this in this generation 1 butterflies, you see green crosses that cross out some butterflies, and these happen to be of a lighter color. Why does it happen? Well, again, recall the previous lecture. What happens to populations? They change when they encounter radical changes in the environment. So imagine that, like it really happened in England in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution, people started to build factories which had pipes that emitted dark smoke. Back then, they did not really care much about environmental protection, and this dark smoke contained particles which sedimented, landed on the bark of trees, and making this bark much darker. So the butterflies that simply because of the variation had lighter color were in disadvantage. They were better seen by predators, birds, right? A light-colored butterfly landing on a dark bark will be eaten with higher probability than a darker colored. So that was a change, and remember, the variation is heritable. The variation that we are considering, natural variation. So when dark butterflies breed between themselves, they increase their presence, their representation, their quota in the population. So in the next generation 2, you see now there is some change, right? There was 1 dark-colored butterfly in generation 1 and 5 light-colored, but because of the selection, right, natural selection of dark-colored butterflies, selection worked in their favor and against the light-colored butterflies. In this generation 2, there are more representatives of the dark-colored butterflies. They gained what Darwin called reproductive success, right? They lived longer and therefore had more children, bigger progeny. Now, in the generation two, again, you see green crosses crossing out light-colored butters. It's selection that works against them. And in generation three, again, same logic. You see even more of the dark-colored butterflies and less light-colored. Then, if you go over, there are now in the generation three there are one, two, three, four, five dark-colored butterflies, and note that there is a cross, green cross, crossing out one of the darker ones. So, what happened? Well, you can hypothesize that something in the environment changed again. Environment is never absolutely stable given. It keeps changing. Maybe some factories that had pipes emitting black smoke went out of business and stopped working. And so there is not as much sediment on the bark of the trees. Some trees became birch has white colored bark. Some of these birches became like safe haven to light colored butters, and now the dark colored butterflies were a more likely target for predators, for birds. And so now the natural selection goes the opposite way. It begins to favor light-colored uh, uh, butterflies and disfavor dark-colored butterflies. So what do we conclude overall from this drawing? That the population of butterflies evolves. It did evolve. It has evolved. However you put it, but the evolution is something that pertains to populations. The population changed its makeup. At some point of time, it had a majority of variant 1 and a minority of variant 2. Then it changed, it evolved, and now we see about equal representation of variant 1, A and variant B. And in with some more time elapsing and with some newer changes in the environment, you see the same population, but now it has a bigger representation of variant B over variant A. So is it really the same population now? Well, yes and no. It is the same. It's still, these are butterflies living in a particular area and able to crossbreed. But the makeup of this population changed seriously, dramatically, right? So the population did evolve. Uh, Now let's be a little bit closer to our time. We were still in previous slides. We were sort of in the times of Charles Darwin in the mid 19th century. Darwin knew nothing about genes, alleles, loci, etc. You guys know, right? You studied biology 1, so you have a concept of a gene. You know that the gene is something that controls the synthesis of a particular protein and thus influences on the appearance and functions of organisms. Uh, Now, if you look at this part, let's first look at the left part of this uh, picture. It shows you frogs, right? These frogs or toads? I think they're frogs. Uh, and you see three variants of these frogs. The majority of this population is represented by green-colored frogs. Then two frogs are a little different. They are, well, sort of more purple colored, and one frog is Again, different, it is red colored. I've never seen red colored frogs in my life, but maybe they really exist. Red colored salamanders really do exist, that's common, but red colored frogs, that's a rarity, but still, well, so let's suppose that they exist. Now, if you look at, just ponder, think about what accounts for these differences. Again, it's not like this red frog exercised to be red. No, it was born red, right? So it's obviously something heritable. It's something in the genes. And below the picture of frogs, you see this egg-shaped uh, kind of oval thing and little dots inside having the same color as frogs. They represent genes. Well, let's suppose that it's one locus. Remember, locus is a place on the chromosome where a gene is, right? So imagine that there is a locus that in frogs is responsible for coloring. And it is represented in three variants or alleles. Remember what alleles are. They are variants of the same locus in different individuals. So if there is a red hair person in your class, I don't know. I've seen some of your pictures, but not all of them. If there is a redhead, then I can tell that person that you and I have one locus, which is the same locus, and you and me, it is controlling the color of our hair. But the alleles of this locus are obviously different because you are red-headed and I'm not. We both have hair, we both have some color in our hair, but the color is different because the alleles in the same locus are different. So now in these frogs there is one locus that controls coloring, and we see three alleles of this locus: one green, one purple, and one red. And the frequency of these alleles are different. The allele of the locus of coloring, which controls or is responsible for the green color, is the best represented, the most prevalent, right? The most uh, frequently seen or detected in the population. The first runner-up is the allele that controls or is responsible for purple color. And finally, the red-colored allele is in the minority. It is represented by just one individual. Then, now let's look at the right part of this picture. It shows you dogs. Right? Dog is a species. Obviously, all these individual dogs are of the same species, and you see they have similar appearance, and they have similar, almost identical length of their legs, and they have peculiar shape of their face, which is also virtually identical, very similar in all these individuals. But they definitely have different coloring, right? And unlike in the picture with frogs, you see three variants of coloring. Here you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? There are dogs in this population that are gray colored, white colored, spotted, black, um, light brown and dark brown, or reddish brown, brick, maroon colored. But if you go over the rows from the top down, how many black dogs do you see in the first row? One, right? How many uh, spotted dogs you see? Also one. Now look at the row number 2 from top. You see 2 black dogs and 2 spotted dogs. Why this change? Well, in the case of domestic animals, the change is most likely to be due to artificial selection. People who are breeding dogs, right? There are people who do it for money. They breed different breeds of dogs and sell them. They deliberately make or they select mating partners of a certain color or certain coloration, spotted, non-spotted, black, non-black, etc. So in the second row compared to the first from top, there is definitely a success of this artificial selection in favor of spotted dogs and black dogs. Uh, on the other hand, gray-colored dogs and maroon-colored dogs are obviously in disadvantage. White-colored dogs and like light brown-colored dogs are also in disadvantage. And again, in this case, this is not because of some changes in the environment, but because the breeder wanted it to be so. But see, in this case, the actions of a breeder, they mimic changes in the environment. So the breeder decided to increase the representation of spotted dogs in the population. So he or she deliberately took spotted dogs and made them mate and have progeny. On the other hand, the dogs with other colors were in disadvantage. They were not selected for breeding, right? So this, imagine that well, if these were wild animals, if they lived in the wild, what could lead to a bigger reproductive success, for example, of spotted dogs? Well, maybe the gene, the allele that controls the spots, is linked to a gene that controls muscle power or something. So the spotted dogs also happen to be faster runners and more successful in hunting or more successful in running away from a predator or whatever. But in any case, something in the environment selected in favor of spotted dogs, and their representation increases with time. Or in other words, let's rephrase the same point. The representation of a certain allele in the population, in the genetic makeup of the population, in the gene pool, changes. Right? It increases for particular alleles, decreases for other alleles. So gene pools change. And here we arrive to a very simple definition of biological evolution. We said individuals do not evolve, populations evolve, right? What does it mean? Each population has its gene pool, a particular number of alleles of a certain locus, which are represented differently in the population, some better, some worse. And there is always a change in this gene pool over time, and that is evolution. That is evolution. Um, I can tell you, I'm not really a narrow specialist in population biology, population genetics, but my degree is actually in genetics, so I do have some uh, background in estimating the representation of alleles, and there is the so-called Hardy-Weinberg law, or Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which says that the frequency of a certain allele in a population remains the same. right? And you can really observe some populations and uh, literally count the number of variants in this population that show you the presence of a certain allele. And you will see that this, like, allele number 1 had a frequency of 10% today, 10% in 1 month from now, 10% in half year from now, etc. Does it mean that there is no evolution? No, it doesn't. Because the Hardy-Weinberg law applies. There are two things that the population has to show in order to be eligible for Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium. First of all, it must be small. If it's a large population, you will see a change in the representation of alleles. And second, it must be under special conditions. For example, mice bred in the laboratory, right? Or plants grown in in a certain greenhouse with care of professional botanists, specialists. So the Hardy-Weinberg law, it is a basic law that really has some background in genetics, but there are more exceptions from it than the rule itself. It was discovered by two British statisticians, actually, Hardy and Weinberg, in the 1920s for small populations that were under watch of specialists in the laboratory. And then when population geneticists started to do large-scale observations of, thousands of wolves, for example, or tens of thousands of oak trees, and calculate the frequency of a certain allele in generation 1, 2, 3, 5, 15, 29, etc. They saw that there is a change in the frequency of a certain allele. So populations do show these changes of the gene pool over time, or in other words, populations do evolve. Now let us take, again, like I said, we are moving from older times to newer times. We discussed something that was discussed in the time of Charles Darwin, the existence of this undefined variation. Then we discussed something that was subject of scientific publications in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. Statistical stuff, representation of the frequencies of particular alleles. Now we are moving to our time, and so we are going from observation of populations to statistical data about alleles, and now to data in the field of molecular biology, molecular genetics. You see, you can now, using technology, which is expanding all the time, becoming more and more modern, you can establish the sequence of nucleotides in a certain gene, a certain locus. And here you see see the same locus, which is present in two people, in a person called Natalie and in a person called Stephen. That's the same gene, same genetic locus, but in the position number 3 from the right, in one of these individuals, you see letter C. It's an abbreviation from cytosine. It's a cytosine nucleotide. And in another person, the same position, third from right, you see a G, right? Guanine nucleotide. So here you have two alleles now, right? You have two alleles. That's exactly what allele is. It's a slight variation in the nucleotide sequences within a locus. By the way, these two alleles could be present in one individual as well, because if you remember from Biology 1, there are pairs of homologous chromosomes, right? So for each locus on one of the chromosomes in a pair, you have a counterpart on the other chromosome in the same pair. And in locus on the chromosome number 1 can be ACACTT, and the same locus, same place in the chromosome 2 of the same pair can be ACAGTT. So there's a discrepancy in one nucleotide, and that makes it allele. So and of course, in a population of individuals, you may have more than two alleles. If you recall, maybe were you, I don't know, were you exposed to the concept of blood groups in Biology 1? Blood types, ABO, they are controlled by one genetic locus, but it has three alleles, A, B, and O. And of course, you cannot have three alleles in the same individual. You can have either one or two. But in a population, like in your class, I can find a person with allele A, with a person with allele B, a person with allele O, a person with two alleles a person with allele A and allele B, etc. Right? So in a population, you can have more than two alleles. You can have multiple alleles. And how do these alleles come to be? How do they appear? Because of mutation. Genes constantly mutate. Genetics is actually all about mutations. Mutation is defined as simply a change in the sequence of nucleotides in a gene. It is random. It has no purpose, right? It's not like, okay, we have a population of flies with dark-colored wings, but because something changed in the environment, there must be a bigger frequency of mutations that change the color of wings from dark to light. Now, that doesn't happen this way. Mutation is random. Mutation by itself does not depend on trivial changes in the environment, like change in the temperature, change in the humidity, change in the chemistry of the soil for plants. That's especially important. Those factors do not influence on the frequency of mutation and character of mutation. Mutations are random, and they do not serve any purpose. They're blind, right? Natalie has C in position 3 from right. Stephen has G in this position 3 from right. Why? Was there any purpose for this change from C to G? No, there was not. What is the basis of mutations, so-called spontaneous mutations? They're not really spontaneous. They are also induced by certain factors, but these factors are ionizing radiation, cosmic radiation, ultraviolet light, certain chemicals like blah, 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 azidophenantrene. They have very long names, these mutagen chemicals. They simply, they hit at random. They hit at the DNA and just happen to affect a certain spot in the DNA and cause this particular mutation. But it's not on purpose. It's blind, random mechanism, right? But listen carefully to this last point in this slide. Because many mutations change traits and are inherited, they are the basis of genetic variation. So you see, in this particular case, this locus was in control of the shape of the earlobe. And in suppose the left, the ear of the person on the left is Natalie's ear. It has it's lobed, right? Has an ear lobe, and Stephen's ear has an earlobe which is attached to the neck. So there is no separate earlobe in this ear. So mutations control particular traits. These traits are heritable, right? So there is a chance that in Natalie's progeny there will be children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren who, or nephews or nieces, etc., who have also lobed ear. And in Stephen's case, his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, his nieces and nephews will, not 100% of them, no, but in quite a lot of cases, there will be this ear with attached earlobe. So that's genetic variation in the populations. Right? That's what makes gene pools heterogeneous. That's what makes a gene pool of any population represented by more than one allele. If there were no mutations, life would be extremely boring. Right? Individuals would have the same traits, like we would all look absolutely alike, like clones. And but mutations bring variation, heterogeneity, diversity, whatever you name. So again, the take-home lesson is that gene pools change, and they cannot not change because of random mutations. Okay, now is mutation the only thing, the only mechanism that changes the gene pool? No. A couple of slides back, and also at the end of the previous lecture, we talked about natural selection, right? So random mutations by themselves introduce a change in the gene pool, right? So they are a mechanism of evolution. But natural selection gives even bigger, brings even bigger change in the gene pool, because certain alleles are selected for or selected against. Right? So this makes really, really dramatic change in the gene pool of populations. So natural selection is a very powerful mechanism of evolution. Darwin actually defined biological evolution as a change in the makeup of populations due to natural selection, because that was the only thing he knew from his vantage point in the 1840s, 1850s. But we now know more. There are 3 more mechanisms of evolution in addition to random mutation and natural selection. These mechanisms are genetic drift, gene flow, and non-random sexual reproduction. Let's take a look at each of them. Natural selection, well, or survival of the fittest. We have been over this. Again, what you need to kind of understand and take home, so the take-home message, is that there is this rather common and absolutely wrong idea about evolution, which is because the environment changed, the individuals responded to this change by adapting. Like, branches of trees started to appear higher from the surface of the earth, and to that, giraffes responded. They responded to this challenge by exercising and making their necks longer. And this is wrong. This is a Lamarckian understanding of evolution. And it was really not confirmed by the subsequent development of biology, genetics. It now has only historical interest. We're not Lamarckists anymore, right? We say that what happens is, at first, there is a random variation, random change of uh, the representation of alleles in the gene pool, which does not, it is not a response of individuals to a change of the environment. It's simply because of the action of these mutagens, like ionizing radiation, cosmic rays, UV light, or whatever, like chemicals. It is random, it is blind. So because of it, if we start from a population which has absolutely identical individuals, in several generations, there will be variation. There will be, like the population started from gray individuals. Now, in generation 5 or 16 or 79, it depends on a particular trait, there will be also gray individuals, but there will be some white and there will be some black. And so variation goes both sides. And this is then this diversity created by random mutation is subject to selection, like unfavorable mutations, mutations that do not make individuals better fit for the environment, are selected against. Remember the example with light-colored butterflies. They are eliminated. They are fired in Donald Trump's language. They are eliminated because they are more likely to lose this battle for life. They are not as well adapted to the environment, and they live shorter lives. They have smaller number of offspring, and so they gradually shrink and disappear. But favorable mutations are selected for, right? For in this picture, black mutants happen to be better fit for the environment. So they live longer, they have bigger progeny, and at the end you see you have favorable mutations are more likely to survive. I would change this wording. I would say or mutants that have favorable traits are more likely to survive. Mutations do not survive. A mutation is a process. It's not a thing. It's not an individual. Mutant is a thing, an organism that carries a certain mutation. And so whatever the grammar, the wording, at the end you see no white variants, right? They were eliminated, fired by evolution. You see a smaller amount of gray individuals. They were not eliminated, but they're losing to black variants again because they are better adapted to the environment than white variants, but not as nicely as the black variants. Right? So that's what shows you that's how the natural selection works. It uh, it it works on a variation that is already established by blind random mutation in genes, right? But then because the mutants are different in terms of their traits being better or worse adapted to the environment, some of the mutants are favored, others are disfavored, and so this changes the gene pool of the population. And on the left part of this picture, you see a population of beetles, which has the population has two alleles of the locus responsible for coloring of the body. One allele is green and one is orange. And so, and here you see a bird that says, green beetles, our favorite. So for some reason, green beetles are, I don't know, maybe they taste better or they're more nutritious or whatever, but birds prefer to eat them, right? So now, if there is this huge, overwhelming predominance of green beetles, what do you think will happen if the same birds remain in this area? What will happen in, say, 5, 10, 15, 27, 100 generations? Definitely there will be an increase in orange-colored beetles, right? Because they escape predators. They escape these birds. They live longer, reproduce, have bigger progeny, right? And so this trait is favored, and that's how the population evolves. Uh, Now, one important thing, guys, this has huge social connotations. What natural selection is not, right? First of all, it is not the survival of the strongest. And this was actually, uh, this wrong understanding of selection was a basis for some pseudoscientists, sciences like eugenics, something like this, that this wrong understanding of Darwin's idea of natural selection was that uh, the nature only selects for individuals that have bigger body, stronger muscles, tougher character, etc. That's not correct because, again, it's all determined by the environment. Look, there is this Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? T-Rex, the dinosaur, which is totally extinct. Look at its body, its muscles, especially on the hind legs, teeth, etc. Looks like this particular organism would be the king of the world, right? No, the environment changed in a certain way. Maybe the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere increased, and the dinosaurs' lungs were not adapted for that very well. So they became extinct. On the other hand, look, this small creature, which is kind of like something in the middle between a rat and a squirrel. It's a primitive mammal. It's actually the predecessor of all currently existing living mammals. It survived. It's thousands of times smaller and weaker than Tyrannosaurus, right? But it was selected because of traits other than just strength of the muscles, size of the body, tenaciousness, cruelty, etc., whatever. Uh, it's not it's not that. Uh, Selection means selection to the particular environment. This environment may favor individuals that are smaller, weaker, slower, and whatever in individuals carry mutants that are in our mind worse than others, but the environment, they fit the environment better nonetheless. And also a point that is kind of similar to the first one. Natural selection is not necessarily moving from simple to complex. As again, one not quite correct, not scientific understanding of evolution is that it moves necessarily from one stage where the organisms are primitive to the next stage when they are still primitive but a little bit more complicated, sophisticated, then more sophisticated, more not always. You see, again, mutations are random, right? And some mutants may uh, appear less complex, more simple, are more primitive than unmutated organisms. Right? There are mutations, for example, in fishes, there are mutations that lead to total blindness. This mutant fish has no eyes, whatever. It has like a snout with no eyes. But, there are underground uh, bodies of water. For example, in caves, there are huge lakes and even rivers that flow from one lake to another, and they are habitable. And what do you think is the best represented kind of fish in these waters? Blind ones, right? They don't need eyes anyway because it's completely dark in this cage. There is no light, right? So if you recall the lecture about special senses, how the receptors of vision work. Uh, Particles of light must interact with the substance called rhodopsin, and this causes some neuronal activity in the retina, etc. But what's the use of having retina and rods and cones and rhodopsin if there is no light? Right? So this mutation happens for this particular environment happens to be favorable. Uh, I don't know exactly what is the molecular genetic mechanism of this, but it seems plausible, for example, that this blindness mutation is linked to a mutation that leads to faster swimming or maybe better sense, more sharper sense of smell or whatever. But somehow it gives advantage to these blind fishes. Right? So in this regard, there's one interesting quote from Charles Darwin which refutes the idea of selection of the strongest and selection from simple to complex. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. Right? So selection does not necessarily favor strong, and selection, paradoxically as it may sound, but it does not always favor intelligent, smart. It may favor something dumb if it fits the environment better. Right? So it's not the strongest that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that is most adaptable to change, right? And don't understand it again in the Lamarckian sense. Adaptable does not mean exercising, responding to the challenge of the environmental change by acquiring some new traits. No, it applies to something that, due to random mutation, natural variation in the gene pool, happened to have traits which are better in this particular environment. Okay. Now, genetic drift, like we said, there are mechanisms of evolution beyond natural selection, which Darwin did not know. Genetic drift, let me just tell you where was this phenomenon discovered and under what circumstances. You might have heard about Krakatoa, right, a volcano which erupted in the late 1800s, and it is, to this day, it is considered the strongest, the biggest eruption of volcano ever. It destroyed the whole island of Krakatoa. And biologists observed that after this really tragic event, thousands of people died, probably millions of uh, organisms in the wildlife perished. There was a huge emission of hot lava and fires and everything. And after this event, the genetic pool of pretty much any population, whatever you look at, changed dramatically. Look, it was not natural selection, obviously, because it happened very fast. Boom, change. right? So the natural selection works gradually in generation after generation after generation. The gene pool becomes slightly changed, then slightly more changed. The representation of a certain allele goes from, say, 1% to 1.5% to 2.1%, etc. And here you see, there were two alleles. One, the representation of one of them was like 11%, and the representation of the other was 89%. And boom, now there is only one allele, and its representation is 100%. The allele with a smaller representation simply disappeared. Right? And so this kind of this is also evolution, right? It's a change of gene pool. It has a different character, but it's the same phenomenon. Gene pool was this, this, and this, and this. Now it is this and this and this. A change in the gene pool of a population. And this change was changed due to sudden catastrophic events that may lead to elimination of simply large numbers of organisms due to catastrophe, fire, flood, volcano eruption, etc. We call it genetic drift, and obviously it may be more powerful than natural selection because it happens so fast. But on the other hand, well, genetic drift is necessarily followed by natural selection, right? And if it just so happened that a better allele happened to disappear and the worse allele happened to stay simply because of the numbers or its numbers were higher, well, woe to it. It will be subjected to negative natural selection, and it will be replaced by you see there's on the right part, lower right corner of this drawing, there is a picture of bugs that have an orange coloring, and among many oranges, there's just one green. Right? It was it due to whatever circumstances, it happened to evade the hit of the volcano eruption or wildfire or whatever flood, and so if it carries if traits that are favorable for the particular environment, it will catch up. It will gradually replace these orange-colored or brown-colored bugs. So that's genetic drift. Gene flow, uh, immigration and emigration. So populations are not stable in the sense that there are newcomers that join them, like refugees, you may say, from other populations. But this newcomer is of the same species, so it can interbreed with the bulk of the population, the natural, right? The population that was already there. And on the other hand, there are emigration cases. Some individuals uh, run away from this particular population for whatever reason and join another population. And again, because they are of the same species, they can start their families there. And this definitely this brings some change in the gene pool, right? So you see the carrier uh, of the immigrant to this population was a carrier of a purple-colored trait, and the immigrant, the individual that ran away from this population, carried a green-colored trait. So, what's the result? Uh, unless the purple trait is subject to negative selection, there will be an increase in the carriers of this purple trait. And unless the green trait is the sort of responsible for some beneficial traits, there will be a decrease in the frequency of this green trait or green allele. Uh, and non-random sexual reproduction. It's also a powerful factor in evolution. Uh, the people who have foggy idea about natural life, they may think that, okay, you have a population, it consists of, say, 10,000 males and 10,000 females. When they reach their reproductive age, then each of them is free to mate with a representative of the opposite sex and have progeny. No, it doesn't really happen in real life, right? In virtually all populations that exist in the wild, there is a competition for mating partners, and this competition may have pretty rough forms. Like, see here, there are two deer that are just, or are they mooses? They clash with their antlers, and they may even kill each other. Right? They are fighting for a female, fighting for the privilege to mate. What's the link between this behavior pattern and gene pool? Well, the successive competitors may actually mate with quite a big number of representatives of the opposite sex and have progeny with them. And so they propagate their traits, their alleles in the population. And really, sometimes population geneticists are surprised because, by all calculations, it was predicted that allele A will have 1% representation, allele B 2% representation, but suddenly it happens that allele A has 0, allele B has 0, and allele X has 75% representation. It simply means that the carrier of the allele X was better at fighting for females if it was a male, or if it was a female, she was better at fighting for male mates. I mean, so that's what non-random sexual replication is. And so please remember these 5 mechanisms of biological evolution, and mechanisms like random mutation, natural selection, uh, genetic drift, gene flow, immigration, and non-random sexual reproduction, and be able to tell us a short story about what these mechanisms are. Do not just memorize particular words and think that this is the right answer. Get a concept, and the best way to getting a context is telling a story. So tell a story of gene flow or genetic drift or natural selection to your friends, to your suite mates, or to your pets. You know, my dogs are probably the best listeners to my stories, especially now that I'm at home. And also, you might tell the story to yourself using a sheet of paper and a pen, and just make kind of notes. Uh, Check yourself. Do you really understand the concept? And then, after you are done writing this on a piece of paper, compare how does your story sound in comparison with the lectures and the textbook. And please, again, my constant advice is study both sources. Study your textbook carefully and study these lectures. If some students say that they are visual learners and they don't need to hear my explanations, fine, turn the sound off and just look at the slides and captions. But in any case, do study these lectures. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and see you at our next lecture, which will be about speciation, about the appearance and disappearance of new species in evolution.